Thanks everyone for being here. Let's get it kicked off. Good morning and welcome to the first event of 2021. We hope that everyone's safe and as well as possible in these very uncertain times. But we thank you for making time to be part of this great discussion today. This event, the Digital Resilience Forum, is a collaborative event between Technology Association of Oregon and Onward Eugene. Woo woo! And we have experienced a variety of disasters in the last 3 years, many years here in the Southern Willamette Valley that has tested our resilience, from the snowstorms and Snowmageddon to the pandemic and this new world of remote work and learning and the wildfires this past summer and fall, and more particularly the holiday farm fire. And so the design of this event this morning is to learn about the various sides of how these disasters have been managed from our local experts in emergency management and response, and have a great discussion on how we can move forward and build more digital and community resilience collectively. So if we haven't met before, I'm Sally Bell. I'm the VP and Executive Director for TAO in Southern Willamette Valley. And we're joined by Matt Sayer, Director at Onward Eugene, and Ruthie Ditzler, our Marketing and Regional Programs Lead from TAO. So before we dive in and get to our panelists and thank our sponsors, just want to talk through the couple of rules of engagement about how we're going to run this today. You've all been muted, so please remain on mute unless the moderator calls on you to speak. You can ask or respond to questions in the chat box. We hope and expect a lively chat box today. And I'll be monitoring that throughout the conversation. We do have some scripted questions, and you're more than welcome to pop questions as we go along in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get to you. You can also use the participant icon to raise your hand if you'd like that as well. Please engage with us on social media today and going forward with TAO and Onward. We'd love to share what's happening at our organizations and get key takeaways from our events. And I think there's going to be a lot of great learning nuggets today. So please engage with us there. And finally, we can't do these great events without our sponsors. So a huge thank you to Emerald Broadband, which was a great instigator in just formulating this event, to Lane County. We couldn't be doing emergency management without our amazing county and our folks there, and to Elevate Technology Group. We appreciate all of your sponsorship and support, and we're really excited to explore these topics today. So now I'm going to pass the mic over to Matt Sayer with Onward Eugene and our partner in this forum. So thanks a lot. We're really excited.
Thank you, Sally. As Sally noted, I'm Matt Sayer with Onward Eugene. Onward is a private sector-led economic development nonprofit helping accelerate an inclusive economic recovery. Before I talk about today, I just wanted to briefly acknowledge the events of yesterday in our nation's capital. My heart is heavy and I'm still processing exactly what happened there. But one thing is clear to me, democracy in America is strong and resilient. So we're here today because we all have an additional interest in another form of resiliency, digital resiliency. And in an emergency, it is all hands on deck. And there are several community groups in the audience, including volunteers from Oregon Internet Response, a lot of great people who are part of Lane County COAD, a lot of great ham radio operators in the audience as well. And each of those groups and individuals play a very important role in emergency response. So I just wanted to give a shout out to all those great groups. So it's great to be working with TAO in this collaborative way. Together, we're creating a platform for a very important conversation. And lastly, I wanted to express my sincere gratitude to today's panelists, many of which I've had the pleasure of learning from over the last several months in volunteering upriver. These folks respond to emergencies on a regular basis, so have a lot of insights to share, and I'm glad we're able to all get together. So, okay, let's get going. It's my pleasure to introduce Lane Tompkins. Lane is the superintendent of the McKenzie School District. Lane was raised in McKenzie Ridge and is a proud graduate of McKenzie Schools. Lane knows firsthand about resiliency, having faced down the Holiday Farm fire this last fall. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Lane Tompkins, today's moderator.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's my first time moderating an event like this, so please be gentle. Just excited to help move this event forward and to help folks learn from this very well respected panel of experts. It's been great getting to know them in light of the events that occurred in our community. And that's kind of been, one of the silver linings that I've experienced was getting to meet and learn and grow from these new relationships that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for this wildfire. So I think I'll turn it over, let the panelists do some introductions and give a little bit of background about their expertise. And let's start with William Chapman.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is William Chapman. I'm the Oregon Statewide Interoperability Coordinator. I work in the Office of the Chief Information Officer, otherwise known as Enterprise Information Services. And my state role during emergencies is to co-lead emergency communications response from the state of Oregon. I share that responsibility with the Public Utility Commission, and it's been definitely a heck of a year. But thanks for having me.
Next, let's hear from Patence Winningham.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Patence Winningham. I'm the Lane County Emergency Manager. I work for the Board of Commissioners and the County Administrator. I'm a direct report to them. And I'm about to start my second year here at the County of Emergency Management in Lane. Thank you.
Paul Braunstein.
Yeah, thanks, Lane. I appreciate being asked to be a panelist, and I appreciate everybody joining today. My name is Paul Braunstein. I live here locally in Clackamas, Oregon, and have been with AT&T since '97, so going on 24 years. I'm with AT&T. I've had a lot of different hats supporting cities, counties, the state within Oregon throughout that time. But the last 3 years, I've been on a team called Firstnet. There's an organization within AT&T called Firstnet. It stands for First Responder Network. And I wear multiple hats being a Firstnet Solutions consultant. I'm educating our public safety and all those groups that support public safety on what Firstnet is. Firstnet is still really new. We'll talk about it a little bit more throughout the forum. But I'm educating constantly on what Firstnet is, what the benefits are to public safety. I also wear a hat of being a liaison to the state of Oregon. So there is a conduit now between the state and actually AT&T on how we respond. And I also wear one final hat where I also report to the federal government. There is a new independent authority, an agency called the Firstnet Authority, who is actually designed and managing this program. So I wear multiple hats, and I'm on a team of two others here that support the state of Oregon that are also listening to the call. So I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. How about Ben Shapiro?
Thanks, Lane. Thank you for moderating this event. Really excited to be here with y'all. My name is Ben Shapiro. I'm a systems engineer at Emerald Broadband. We're a local ISP here serving rural communities in Lane County. Additionally, I'm a volunteer with Oregon Internet Response, and I am a ham radio operator. So glad to share some insights and some nerd topics with everyone today. I'll hand it back to you, Lane.
Thanks, Ben. Jerri-Jo Payne.
Hey there, my name is Jerri-Jo Payne, and I'm a longtime resident of the Eugene area. Started my nursing career at Sacred Heart and have had a variety of roles with PeaceHealth, but I'm currently the network director for all things technology, and work with the next guy you're going to hear from pretty soon. I also have the hat of not only a citizen and healthcare worker, but also I'm a business owner up the Mackenzie River. So all of that happened was very near and dear to my heart as well.
Thanks, Jerri-Jo.
Mm-hmm.
John Nornberg. You still with us, John?
As my boss says, I need to be better at mastering the mute button. I'm John Norenberg, System Vice President of Technology and CTO. I am relatively new to the area. I've been with PeaceHealth formally now for 18 months. My home is still in suburban Chicago, while I have an apartment here in Vancouver. And prior to COVID, my wife and I were traveling back and forth to be with each other. But after COVID, that came to a sudden halt. So I just got done with 7 weeks of being in suburban Chicago and working from there. About 20 years in healthcare and an additional 15 to 20 years in other industries as IT, and on both the technology applications, and I've been a CIO twice in my career as well.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks for being here, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. So I think now's the time where we're going to transition into some questions that have been assembled to move things forward. This is a question, we'll start with one that all of our panelists will be able to speak to, but I think we'll start it with our emergency management coordinator for the county, Patence Winningham. So Patence, what is emergency management and how does it support us in disasters?
Great, thanks, Lane. I want to first and foremost say that as an emergency manager, I support many individuals in their facets in the walks of life, and that starts with the individual citizen and their overall preparedness. Preparedness is across the board, applicable to all, including first responders, local jurisdictions, the cities, and all of our partners, and really making sure everybody is well tooled for any natural disaster or man-made disaster. So we saw what happened yesterday. That was extremely upsetting for that community. They were impacted, but it also impacted our country. And how do we prepare ourselves for things such as that, but also preparing ourselves for things such as the holiday farm fire, including our communications. We all know that communications had failed. I think that's one of the big topics here for this group is how did we fare in emergency alerting as individuals in that community for receiving emergency notification information. That's part of my job, is really understanding those systems and what they're interdependent on, what our failure points are, and what communication methods we could utilize to get out. So that's just one piece of preparedness, but my job is really looking at our hazards and our vulnerabilities across the board and identifying those risks and trying to mitigate those risks as we move forward. So emergency management is really first and foremost about preparedness, because it's a whole community approach. And I feel that it's extremely important for me to share the information with our community members and our partners about our interdependencies and our vulnerabilities. How do we support each other to get through our worst day, right? We don't know what we can't see, and you as community members, but also community stakeholders and organizations, you don't understand our gaps until we inform you what those gaps are. So I've learned along the way, part of my role in the city of Eugene was preparedness and outreach and informing our community members. And some of the questions that came up for me were really resonating, because I had no idea what they didn't know, because me in emergency management, I know a lot. So some of the questions that came to me, or ways that I posed questions to the community that would be beneficial for this group, is, how many ambulances do you think we have on duty at any given time? And the numbers sometimes were frightening. They were like, oh, we have 25 ambulances. No, we don't have 25 ambulances. And well, how many dispatchers do you think we have that are answering that 911 call? And one of the things I learned for 911, just talking to the dispatchers and the dispatch supervisor, well, we have 3 to 5 dispatchers at any given time, depending on the timing of the day. So then you throw a disaster on that, use that to leverage your explanations to community members about the reasons why not to call 911 unless it's actually a life-saving emergency, right? Well, there's a tree on my house, and I got to hear lots of stories from the community about reasons why they would call 911 and why it's important not to tie up those lines. We also work on mitigation. So mitigation is mitigating those risks, and we have a really nice mitigation plan that we review twice a year, and it identifies those big gaps and puts it down in a plan. You can see this on our website, but there's about 30 items that we really identify as risks for Lane County, and based on what hazards: wildfire, snowstorm, landslide, what have you, flooding. And we can look at those things and apply those to grant funding, to planning projects, to mitigation projects. Where do we make that culvert bigger, or where do we not build next time because it's a big risk? That's just another piece of the pie. One of the things I'm learning right now, and as a part of my job, we don't ever get there, is recovery. So here we are moving into recovery for the Holiday Farm fire, and it's going to be a long road ahead. Recovery is not quick. We are in the short-term recovery for the McKenzie River corridor, and it's all things recovery. It's housing, it's economic development, it's infrastructure, it's getting the small things, that community back up into their I call it normal habitat, or their environment, right? I live in McKenzie Bridge, and I grew up in McKenzie Bridge, and I know how it's been impacted, and how do we rebuild, and how do we rebuild more resilient, right, to withstand the next wildfire or the next flood. The other piece of my job is really supporting first responders. So all the law enforcement and fire departments, making sure they have all the information and tools that they need to do their job. So in the Holiday Farm fire, for example, they stood up that incident command post, or ICP, at Thurston High School, and they did their job. They moved people, they were putting out the fire, and Patience's job was to pay attention to sheltering, communications, and meeting any resource needs that they had at the incident command post. That's what I do in my response, with my response hat on. And then I worked a lot with OIR and William Chapman on communications, because that was another huge gap in that McKenzie River corridor, was restoring communications as well as power. So working with the utilities to get the resources that they need to do their job, to accomplish their mission. And with that, I'll stop.
So before this started, I just want to let you, Matt swore me in to be a neutral moderator, but for full disclosure, Patience is one of my bosses. She also serves as one of our school board members, and she actually babysat me when I was younger. So if you are picking up any preferential treatment for Patience during today's session, it's probably happening. So just let you know. But thank you, Patience, for shining some light into emergency management for us. I just kind of want to turn it to any of the other panelists. What does emergency management from your perspective look like, and how do the resources you have help us through these disasters? So feel free to jump in if anybody wants to weigh in on this one as well.
Thanks, Lane. I'll weigh in a little bit. I'm also Team Patience. She's been really awesome through this entire event, and working with her has been just an awesome privilege. But from the state's perspective, I like to think of emergency management as more of emergency coordination. Most of my career up until I took this position was actually on the first responder side, responding to fires, responding to emergency medical incidents, law enforcement incidents, and kind of being there during the incident, mitigating the emergency, and then moving on to the next one, or going back to the station. And it wasn't until that I really got out of that mindset and really understood that there's so much more that goes around the emergency before it happens, while it's going on, and then after. And that's really where emergency management or emergency coordination comes in. It's preparing for those emergencies. The emergency that we're prepared for doesn't become an emergency. When we help people become resilient, when they can meet their own needs, then there's no need for us anymore. And I think that's our ultimate goal, is to help both the community and then our first responders and employees become resilient to the point that they don't need outside help. If we can do that, then we don't have to go into response mode and recovery mode. But during response, from my perspective, my job in emergency management is to really to support patients, and to support those first responders. And I'm lucky that my day-to-day job is that as well. I support public safety and help them interoperate with each other and communicate on a daily basis, and how they plan for that, how they talk to each other, how 911 centers work together, how we do alerts and warnings across the state. And so when these big emergencies happen, it's just kind of a natural extension for me to go out and reinforce those things that we've already discussed ahead of time. And then just like Patience said, recovery is a new one for me. Rebuilding and how do we come back stronger than before? How do we build things so that the next time the fire comes through, they don't fail, or they don't go down. And so that's kind of emergency management for me.
From my standpoint, when I think about emergency management, I have two thoughts, and they're very related. And the first is that it's almost impossible to become an effective IT leader without understanding emergency management. We are not governed by any laws, but we're governed by a set of best practices that indicate what would happen should we have a disaster that affects our ability to communicate and use our mission critical systems. I'll give you an example. My old employer, one of our two primary data centers, and was in one of the main tertiary hospitals and quaternary hospitals for all of Chicagoland. And it also happened to be in the glide path of O'Hare Airport, which means that we were constantly thinking about what would happen if a plane would miss its takeoff or its landing and plow into that building. We practiced that one actually quite a bit. Same as with healthcare. It's very difficult to become a senior healthcare leader without having a very firm sense of paranoia about the big disasters. In my old employer, because it was Chicagoland, we did a lot around civil unrest. We did a lot around when Chicago was in the running for the 2016 Olympics. We did a lot of drilling around mass casualties and things of that nature. I will tell you that I've never been in an area where forest fires were a big problem. And so when the bug out line for the fire in Eugene began to bear into one of our primary two data centers, I was faced with having to purposefully shut down a very large data center on short notice, something I never thought I'd ever have to do. But at that point, all the training around emergency management that comes with first IT and then healthcare kind of kicked into gear, and that training paid dividends. While we didn't shut down the data center, it was not operating anywhere near capacity because we had moved everything out. Fires also do really weird things to big bundles of optic fiber, which we found out as well. What's unique to this area is with the rivers in play, there are very few right-of-ways where data circuits can go. And when one of those burns, it really stresses out the remainder of the system. So emergency management to me is something we do, and something you prepare for. And the older you get, the more gray hair or less hair you have, like me, the more you realize that you haven't seen it all, even though the days you think you have, and that the next big one is around the corner and you just need to be ready.
Thanks, John. Anybody else care to weigh in on emergency management? So that awkward pause was a tool that came from the classroom from my time as a high school history teacher. So I'll take that as we're ready to move forward. So this one, I think, Paul, you could probably speak best to this one. What resources do private sector telecommunications companies offer during a disaster? And then tell us a little bit more about FirstNet. You talked a lot about one of your jobs is really educating. So kind of break it down for us. What is FirstNet and what role does it play?
Yeah, thanks, Lane. And again, thanks for having me as a panelist. Again, Paul Braunstein, a FirstNet solutions consultant here in the Portland area. And again, I wear multiple hats. I'm educating public safety and those groups that support public safety every single day, multiple hours a day on just what FirstNet is. It's part of our role is to educate the benefits of FirstNet. FirstNet's only about 3 years old, so not that many people still really have a good grasp of what FirstNet is. I do work for AT&T. I'm an AT&T employee. We are a private partner. We are a vendor to many of the panelists that are on this call, and we're probably a vendor to many of you that are participants on the call today. I would say between the private community and the public community, there is a strong relationship that goes together in the response of emergencies. If we think about an emergency response, it's really our government. It's our federal government, it's our state government, it's our county government that are managing proactively these events. They're the ones managing events, but the private community are brought in to help mediate some of these issues that they're having. Establishing communications is one of the most important things to get established up front, so that our government, our first responders can communicate and manage the event. But if we talk about specifically the differences of what a private company can offer and what we're doing with FirstNet from a telecommunications standpoint, a private vendor is really responding in a best effort nature, meaning that they're glad to help, they will respond, but having certain committed timeframes, availability on assets is something that most telecommunications or wireless carriers are offering today. It is really just best effort. They'll get to it if resources become available. FirstNet has been designed to really change the game and really have a commitment to public safety, have contractual commitments on our deliveries, our timelines, and our availability of our assets and our network. To understand this a little bit greater, let me just take a few minutes to explain what FirstNet is and why we came about. There's been emergencies from man-made to natural disasters affect us for decades. And it seems, unfortunately, more and more of these disasters seem like they're happening more and more often. But what really, there was a specific event that really affected communications that really changed the game in terms of how the government thought there needed to be a change. And that event that really happened was 9/11. We all know what happened in New York on 9/11. There was a terrorist attack, the buildings came down, and there was a response. There was a response from first responders. There was a response from our utilities, our transportation organizations, our schools, our healthcare system. And the problem during 9/11, which is the same problem that occurs up until right now, is a lack of interoperability, meaning a lack of communication response between all of these different convening organizations. And if you ask yourself, why is there a lack of interoperability or communications between these organizations, is because of two reasons. One, all these federal organizations, private companies use radios, walkie-talkie systems, and there's 10,000 different radio systems throughout America, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. So when you have different groups convening on scene, trying to organize an event, you might have a police organization, a fire organization, an EMS organization convening on scene, all with different radio types of handsets, and they can't talk to each other. The fallback is using cellular devices, commercial devices from our companies like Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile. But the problem there is that a lot of times the networks don't fail. But in these events, there's so many people trying to communicate. You've got our first responders, our supportive agencies, and our citizens trying to call for help, that these networks just get congested. And even up till right now, and what really put a focus on 9/11 was our emergency responders didn't have any levels of prioritization above anybody else. And so calls, data, text, pictures did not go through, even though that the next networks were available. So what happened after 9/11 is that there was a spotlight put on this communications issue for our first responders. There was a push directly from public safety. So police, fire, and EMS really got together and started lobbying Congress saying, hey, we need something better. Our tools that we're using today are the same tools that the average citizen, the average teenager are using to communicate, and this is not working. Federal government heard that in 2010. So it took about 9 years of lobbying for first responders to make a change. 2010 came along, and the federal government actually said, okay, we're going to actually follow a recommendation that came from the 9/11 Commission and the lobbying of first responders. And they said, we're going to put a stake in the ground, and we are going to follow the recommendation that came from the 9/11 Commission, which was we are going to build a dedicated network for our public safety, a network that they've been asking for since 9/11. So for 9 years, we're going to actually now build a network. So they put a new agency together, the Firstnet Authority, which is a independent authority within the Department of Commerce to actually help design and manage this program. There was money set aside, there was frequency for network set aside to make it a privatized network. So this group, this Firstnet Authority, got together and started doing consultation for multiple years. So about 4 years of consultation went on throughout the entire country, throughout all the territories, gathering feedback from our first responders, asking, what do you need from this network? They came back 4 years later in 2016 and said, you know, the federal government, we have what is needed to build this. We have what public safety is needing, but we don't have the expertise to build it. So they wrapped this information up into an RFP, put it out to the private community to really take a look at what public safety was asking for and develop a response. AT&T was one of 3 respondents to that RFP, looking at 3,000 different requests that were developed in that RFP from a need from public safety. AT&T was awarded the contract in 2017. So what this gives AT&T is the ability to build, upgrade, and maintain a privatized network just for our public safety community. A privatized wireless network that has commitments, timelines, availability to our public safety. So in layman's terms, the way you want to think about FirstNet to sum FirstNet up is we are now a new wireless carrier in the marketplace. You've got the public carriers, our commercial carriers, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T that are all best effort networks doing the best they can to maintain their networks and to help respond to emergencies. FirstNet's been established as a new 4th wireless carrier in the marketplace. We are actually recognized as a separate carrier because we have separate frequencies, dedicated core of the network that the FCC does see as a separate carrier. But FirstNet is there to support our public safety's mission, our public safety's needs of communications. Beyond the traditional contractual commitments that we have to public safety and our availability commitments, what we offer from a FirstNet perspective is myself, my colleagues that are here in Oregon that are on this call that are FirstNet consultants are not just a vendor anymore. We're building relationships with people like Patence and Will at the state level of making sure they know who they can rely on. Myself, my colleagues, we're all trained at a FEMA level to really understand now the framework of how an emergency is managed. We can go into an emergency operations center, sit next to Will and Patence and understand the language that they are using during these events. We actually have a separate response operations group called ROG. And what this group does is when there is an emergency, myself being a liaison to the state, I will go actually sit in the operations center next to Will, next to all of the other partners from an agency perspective, all of the other private partners, and take in whatever requests or needs that the state, that the county, that the cities have, and directly be a liaison to report those requests to our response operations group. Our response operations group is a coordinated effort between our national disaster recovery teams that manage a lot of our assets that you see right behind me there, and our local network teams. So immediately as requests come in, specifically, we're talking about the Mackenzie fire, as those requests for assets for better communications come in, I'm relaying that to a team that can make immediate decisions to deploy assets out into the field. And so whenever a request came in, we have now a commitment to deliver, either getting our network established, getting an asset on scene, and making communications available to first public safety. That's our first mission. But the second mission is to make sure that the citizens in the area are taken care of. So to sum all of what I really, to sum up the question, there's a big effort being taken place, especially with the Mackenzie wildfire, to bridge the gap between our state and local partners and our private community, because we can all come together for a response. From a FirstNet perspective, we go a little bit farther now and have actually committed contractual requirements to make sure that those communication efforts are met.
Thanks, Paul. So I kind of like to shift to William for a second. So Paul just kind of talked about a really nice piece of infrastructure that's at your disposal for communications. But what in your perfect world, William, what should communications infrastructure preparedness look like? And then what sort of training do you think needs to happen so that way, your agency works well with FirstNet, works well with the counties that you work with?
I was muted, sorry. Thanks for the question and the opportunity to respond. But from a resiliency and preparedness perspective, I think one of the things that we're really seeing and have seen throughout the disasters is we have to prepare and be ready for these things because they are going to happen at some point. The Eugene area was hit hard by Snowmageddon, and we had a lot of lessons learned by that. Fuel and generators run out, and if we can't get fuel up there, or there is no generator, those things go down, and we have to have a plan for that, and we have to prepare for that and build them to better standards. The Association of Public Safety Communication Officials, in cooperation with ANSI, the standards developers, have put together public safety grade resiliency requirements for telecommunication sites, and that's a voluntary standard that really represents the best practice in preparedness and resiliency. And so I think from my perspective, we would really like to see those private telecommunication industries and our providers take a look at those standards and get some of those best practices and incorporate them into their designs and even upgrade their existing infrastructure. And I think the cell carriers in particular have done a really good job of that. They've looked out at their sites and seen, hey, our generator's only good for 12 hours. Well, that's great, but what happens at 12 hours after the emergency? We've just gotten our response ramped up, and all of a sudden our communications die. So that's where those standards really come into play, and having and being able to take a real hard look at your own infrastructure and say, where are our vulnerabilities? Because last thing you want to be doing in the middle of a fire is trying to find somebody who can drive a truck full of flammable material up to a site and refill. So I think that's a big part of just being prepared. You mentioned training. I wanted to kind of take a step back and what private can do during emergencies. I think that there's probably a little bit of a misconception that the government's going to come in and solve all the problems. We respond and we do our best, but we at the state level and the county level, we only have so many resources at our disposal, and 9 times out of 10, it's life safety. How do we save the most lives as quickly as we can? And outside of that, our resources get really stretched thin. I don't have trailers full of satellite equipment that I can deploy out into the state. I don't have portable cell towers or portable radio towers. We have a few in the state, but in these very large emergencies, equipment and personnel start running short. And I think that's where we really rely on our private sector and our nonprofit community partners. I know patients will back me up when I say this, but we couldn't do it without our nonprofit and private sector partners. Everything from housing evacuees to putting up portable communications towers, and so them being available to come in, we do rely on them. One thing that we really learned a good lesson on with particularly the Holiday Farm Fire and the other fires throughout Oregon was pre-existing relationships are huge, and the training to go in with them. There's a component of training called the Incident Command System. That's part of the National Incident Management System that we want everybody to be trained in. Lane, you as a leader in your school have probably taken ICS classes, and people in hospitals, people in private companies, people in nonprofits, people in government. There's a particular section of those trainings that we want everybody to take. And that way, when the emergency happens, we are speaking the same language. We have a clear, defined lexicon, and when I say something, you know what I'm talking about. And so that's huge, being prepared to come in and have those conversations and speak the same language. But again, back to those pre-existing relationships, my unofficial motto as the SWIC is interoperability really begins and ends with relationships that are developed. And if we have those relationships built ahead of time and we're used to working together, and I know who to call, or you know how to get a hold of me, then during emergencies, when time is of the essence, it's just so much quicker. Expectations are there. The paperwork's been worked out ahead of time, and we can get to helping people that much faster. So that's a really big part of it. Just being prepared to come in and one of our biggest fears in emergency management is the spontaneous volunteers. It just becomes really hard to manage. So if I could say anything, it's just engage with us early before the emergency. Thanks.
You know, dovetail on the ICS training. If anybody out here, you know, the attendees are interested, that's all free. You can go onto the FEMA website and take those ICS and other incident management courses for free. So one thing, you know, patients talked about preparation. That's something you can do, you know, as you're hanging out at home, instead of scrolling through social, you can be learning about ICS through FEMA. I'd like to pull Ben in real quick. William, you talked about kind of the public-private partnership and relationships. Ben, I'm hoping you can speak a little bit about how, you know, that has worked out in this incident, how it can have more resilient communications. And then you want to tell us a little bit about HAM?
Yeah, definitely, Lane. Those are all topics I'm ecstatic to talk about. As far as the response to the Holiday Farm Fire goes, Emerald participated with the Oregon Internet Response to try to establish communications there. As a former geologist, or at least student of geology, Oregon has very diverse geological landforms, which translates into very difficult topography for actually building infrastructure compared to a lot of the rest of the US. In particular, the Mackenzie River Valley is this really long, narrow valley that doesn't have great coverage of the sky. So a lot of solutions that have been developed to restore telecommunications are satellite-based. And in this case, there was only one satellite available, and it was kind of a choke point for bandwidth. So Emerald, as a private sector entity, has access to assets and resources that we can make available very rapidly. So I see that as a very useful contribution to emergency responses. But I would also like to recognize that the state and local county governments and federal government provide a very good schematic for getting those resources where they needed to be. There was this telecommunications coordination call that's happening on a daily basis to a weekly basis to kind of align all of us private sector participants, because we might tend to be insular within our own organizations, and it really provided a good bridge to get resources where they needed to be. I think what telecommunications companies like Emerald should provide is expertise and bandwidth in the future, because we don't necessarily know where the connection needs to come from. If you have flatland, satellite, and cell phone technology is a really great solution. If you have a really deep river valley, those solutions that may work in the flatlands do not work. And in this particular case, we were able to beam internet from Bend across mountaintops, a couple of mountaintops into the valley. I think going forward, I want Emerald to provide bandwidth to local, county, state, and federal agencies to increase monitoring in the environment. That could be wildfire cameras, because often wildfires happen in really remote areas that you don't have eyes on. And you don't realize there's a fire until it gets very far away from its ignition point and it's already kind of spiraling out of control. That could also be county air monitoring agencies, or it could just be more resilient connections between the USDA Forest Service or county assets out there. So I think there's a lot the private sector can provide as far as solutions. And I think state emergency management agencies, local and county emergency management agencies really provide that connection to get those assets where they need to be as quickly as possible.
So then, you know, Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot again here. Like, what happens when everything fails? Like, what's the backup plan? What should we turn to?
You should turn to ham radio. A good way I can explain this is think for a moment you're sending a text message to a family member. Okay, it's not that much data. It's a couple bytes maybe. What you don't tend to think about is how much equipment that data goes through, how much money that data goes through. It's millions of dollars. Ham radio, you can essentially do the same thing with a couple $100 radios point to point. Internationally, if you're using a tonal mode we call FT8, which can send text across the globe. If you listen to that frequency, it sounds like white noise effectively, and you look at your computer and it starts decoding text. It's amazing. Or if you're an OIR volunteer who's also a ham radio operator, you're aligning antennas over a ham radio. You have point-to-point voice communication over tens of miles. If you're using a mountaintop repeater, it can be upwards of 90 miles away from each other. So absolutely, get a ham radio license. It is a great thing you can do for personal safety. I've been encouraging all my coworkers to do it. And you start from there. You can build data networks with ham radio. You can connect those data networks to telecommunications companies that are actually linked to the internet. So you have an internet gateway. I think it all really starts with ham radio, and the community around ham radio has a very diverse set of skills. That might be emergency management communication, that might be electronics and embedded systems. It's a really awesome enthusiast community. And ham radio has historically supported a lot of emergencies. They were critical for restoring communications during 9/11 in New York. They were critical for the last major hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. Hams were up in the middle of the night on very long wavelengths, relaying communications from the island. They are a very awesome resource that I feel is often overlooked in our communities.
So I know John Nornberg, you wanted to weigh in a little bit on the other ways public and private sectors can collaborate.
Actually, this is less a way and more of a plea. Healthcare is interesting because it is not legally, but in the way we act, we're a weird combination of both public and private sector in the way we view the world. As a result, in the case of an emergency, we are consumers of both public and private sector services. So what I would like to see is a tighter linkage between the public and the private sector, especially with the coordination of the very limited and oftentimes hyper constrained resources that are coming through. And I'll give you a couple of examples. When COVID hit, there was a mass, first off, products coming back from China, that supply chain was broken. And then there was this mass move to buy technology, so people working from home, doing school from home, et cetera, et cetera. And the supply of computers and monitors and things like cameras and Wi-Fi cards was really, really constrained. And at that moment, that was the exact moment that we needed all this gear in volumes that we have never, ever purchased before. And it took, 90 days for industry to say, okay, wait a minute, we've really got to go prioritizing healthcare and get our healthcare customers to the top of the line, because this is affecting our response nationally to this crisis. The second example is when one of the bridges caught on fire, and we burned this big optic fiber bundle. 18 inches of optic fiber is impressive, and when it burns, it looks like the alien from Aliens. And all of a sudden, our bandwidth was cut in half at the very best. And it took far too long for our telecom carriers to say, wait a minute, we've got to prioritize the healthcare traffic, because if you cut a hospital off from its EMR, there isn't a ham radio network in the world that's going to be able to handle that data traffic. And so we've got to have the resumption of service to keep our hospitals running, because we are now utterly dependent upon the EMR networks. So, the ability for private and public sector to work together, for the public sector, folks like patients to be able to work with the private sector and make the case to say, hey, it's not always healthcare, but these certain things need to be prioritized. These services, these, healthcare, public safety, these things need to be prioritized, and your limited resources need to be funneled here, and put the pressure on those folks to make those decisions is something that we really need. The good news is they always come to the right decision. The bad news is it takes them, 90 days, the problem may be resolved, right? And the damage is irreparably done. So, if we could turn 90 days into 90 minutes, that would be kind of perfection for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'd like to provide an example there, John, that I've built relationships. I've been doing emergency management for some time now. I think I'm starting on year 15 or 16 now, but I met this guy at Peterson Cat when I was a newbie, and what Peterson Cat has, they've got heavy equipment and generators. Like, that guy, I need to know him and be his friend, because he's got resources I could use. I built that relationship, better understood his gaps, his capabilities, how he could help me. He's in the private sector, but I first and foremost, generators, I need backup power, I need heavy equipment, put him in my queue of things to know. I've called him in Snowmageddon. and needed a generator on Oak Ridge High School to provide power so that we could set up a shelter there, right? Public safety is first. And his question to me, well, how big a generator, and can it receive it? I'm like, I don't know. Here's the guy's phone number at the school. If you can send an electrician and just make it happen, we're solid. Send me the bill, right? The other caveat there is that I use Peterson Cat for the utility power restoration for Holiday Farm Fire in Blue River. We got him a big enough generator to get that power back on for Upper McKenzie as quick as that, right? I called him that day and said, I need a generator. Here's the phone number to the utility. Can you make it happen? He was on it. I gave it, delegated it. It was going to happen one way or another. As we're learning here in communications, you brought up a really good point, and we kind of, I stepped in this hole, but I'm going to stand on, I'm still pretty new at the county level. First and foremost is public safety for communications for me. I really need to be able to provide communications infrastructure for first responders to do life safety. Verizon and AT&T placed those pieces of equipment in there to provide additional cellular capability. One, for first responders, but two, the community got to take advantage of that. And the restoration for communications infrastructure up there is extremely long. And the longevity of leaving those pieces of equipment up there when the life safety piece has pretty much gone away, for the most part, the equipment, was time for it to roll out. And that's when everybody got really upset, because they're like, wait, everything's leaving. Well, everything's leaving because the life safety piece is now gone. The cellular company has restored their service back to pre-fire conditions. But those people had been spoiled a little bit in that they had a cell tower in their front yard and provide them 5 bars, whereas in the blue sky day, they had maybe 2 bars. And it was providing support to keep the economy going. So there's those two pieces that we really have to balance, and building those relationships with the communications partners to better understand how all those pieces fit together with William, with Paul, and our dispatch units to better understand that is extremely beneficial for me to better understand what to ask for and when.
Yeah, I would like to add fuel to that. The only thing more terrifying than taking a data center dark on purpose is trying to manage which services you provide at what time of day, at what time of week, because your fuel is constrained. And those generators, they don't sip fuel, they gulp it. And build the ready availability of fuel to power those communication things, et cetera, is really important as well.
Yes, sorry I complained so much when those left patients. Thank you for getting them in there in the first place. But there was a lot of concern when those towers did eventually leave. I wanted to a question that was in the chat from Randy Niels that I thought was pretty interesting that I'd like to pull in is, now that many of you have been through a major emergency, how will you be changing the way that you negotiate your supply agreements with telecom companies to ensure you get the priority of restoration that your operation demands? I know we have panelists on both sides of maybe that negotiation. Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a real quick run at it. Kathy Orcutt also put a comment in about programs called GETS and WPS, and I'll add a third one in there called TSP. GETS is the Government Emergency Telecommunications System, WPS is Wireless Priority Service, and TSP is Telecommunications Service Priority. And those three programs together form the foundation of telecommunications restoration within the United States. They're put together by the FCC and the good folks at CISA, and they help us on the government and public safety side and critical infrastructure side restore or gain priority on communications networks. GETS is generally for landline telephone use. WPS is typically for cell phones, and then TSP is really for, I need to build something quickly, or I need to restore something quickly that has gone down. And they've been really great programs. They've helped us in numerous emergencies. Sometimes when a local network is just overwhelmed, WPS and GETS lets us get our traffic in ahead of the general public, similar to how FirstNet does, but on a little bit more of a rudimentary basis, so that we can at least get our message out as soon as there's a conduit available. It doesn't let us kick anybody out of line, but at least gets us to the front. And TSP is a really, really interesting one, and one that I hope to educate more organizations on the critical infrastructure side, the healthcare side, and the government side about. TSP, telecommunication service priority, again, is priority on either getting something new installed and built, or if it's already been designated as a TSP site, it goes to the front of the line for restoration. And these programs are available to hospitals, to medical offices, to 911 centers, fire departments, police departments. If you have a protective service mission, typically you're eligible for those services. We see almost nobody taking advantage of them within Oregon. GETS and WPS are essentially free, and TSP is very cost efficient, something like $8 a month or per circuit or something like that. So when we have these critical services, it's about getting out ahead of it, signing up for those services. And I think that directly carries into what Randy asked about with service level agreements. The TSP program kind of helps us provide those service level agreements during disasters, because we don't know where the next disaster is going to hit. We don't know exactly what circuits are going to be impacted or what infrastructure is going to be taken down. So TSP kind of lets us designate what's important ahead of time, and then motivates those carriers to help us get them restored. But for restoration, it's got to be done ahead of time. So you have to go register, you have to get all the circuits identified and set up for that restoration. So that's one thing that kind of bit us with this particular emergency on the holiday farm fire is nobody was registered for it. So building education on that. Patience has put in a link about some of those telecommunication service priority and GETS. There are some eligibility requirements, but generally, if you're critical infrastructure or public safety, you qualify. So I highly recommend checking those out and looking into that. The other thing I really quick just wanted to touch on when we had the ham discussion, I wanted to bring up was kind of what we call hams in the emergency management world, and that's called Auxcom, or auxiliary communicators. It's kind of a catch-all term for the different organizations that provide those services, ARRL or RACES, to groups that are not affiliated with any formal organization. We kind of provide that catch-all term for Auxcom, but Auxcom is also a form of training that takes those ham skills, marries it with incident management and emergency management skills, and so that way those ham radio operators speak our same language again on the emergency management side and can plug directly in to the organization. There is one organization I also wanted to mention with the private public partnership that has also been really active in Holiday Farm and throughout the fires, throughout COVID within the area, and that's the Information Technology Disaster Resource Center. Itdrc for short is kind of a group. I call them the Red Cross of IT, and they're a conglomerate, the disaster response arm of many of the major IT and software companies across the United States, and they have some staff and volunteers that are available to respond out into these emergencies. So if your organization's interested in response, but maybe you don't know how to do it, or you don't feel comfortable stepping into that role as your own organization, I highly recommend that you look into that response and maybe become affiliated with them. Thanks.
Thanks,
I also
William.
just, Lane, if I can just take a second, just clarify a couple things. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that, from the FirstNet perspective, I did mention federal government, state government, and our first responders. FirstNet, we can come in and talk to really any supportive group that's part of an emergency response. And when I say supportive group, if we think about it in a response, we've got our first responders, and then all of these organizations. It could be a public or a private organization that is there getting the call to support in an emergency and come in as that second wave or third or fourth wave of emergency response. FirstNet's there not just to support our federal government and our first responders, it's there to support all of these different supportive organizations, our healthcare, our utilities, our schools, our transportation organizations. If you're an organization that is contractually obligated to support an emergency event, FirstNet can help. And we're collaborating with a lot of different types of private organizations. Kathy Orcutt, who was mentioned about the priority services, that's something that we can link on to our FirstNet service to make FirstNet even that much more reliable. FirstNet's not 100% availability. It's not going to work 100% of the time, but if we can find ways to help make it stronger, we're going to do that.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that mute button malfunction there. I wanted to touch on a couple of themes that kind of have come up from different speakers that I want to make sure we got into today. And it was two big themes of like planning, preparation, and training. And I'm hoping I can pull Jerri-Jo in and she can speak a little bit more about the role of planning and training and preparation has for businesses, but then also any other agencies that, you know, might need to be thinking about next steps they can take.
Great, thank you. I'm thrilled to have that opportunity. Just a shout out, just to prove I have my oh, you can't see it, my GETS card. Yeah, and the credit goes to, you know, I work with it takes a village, right? I mean, healthcare is a big endeavor. PeaceHealth is not a small organization, but we have, who's not here today, and who really does the heavy lifting of most of the preparation on the big emergency side of things is really our emergency management coordinator. His name's Grant Finch. Before him was Elijah Davis, that some of you I bet know. Paige, yep, I see your heads nodding out there. And then of course, working for Ronnie Dersham. She's awesome. So, but I get to be here to share with you. You know, it's interesting to have had the roles that I've had, because I can think back on when I was a brand new nurse in the late 80s. And what did we do for, you know, we had fire drills, that kind of thing, just like you would in school. And fast forward, even then, the systems that we used, we did have some systems that were, dare I say, computerized with very different technology back then. But it is truly amazing how much we have online now. We have gone in terms of a pendulum swinging from, you know, at your home, you might even see that you're going from being, you know, install computer software onto your own computer versus now maybe you've got things up in the cloud, right? When you think about your businesses out there and how much do you have on a single laptop or a single computer versus it being networked. So I was thrilled that John was able to speak to our data center and some of what we were dealing with during the fires. In terms of back to the single caregiver, we tend to call our employees not staff or employees, but caregivers. And they're not just the health, you know, they're not just the nurses directly at the bedside where we all have a piece in that. So when I think of, you know, how do we prepare our individuals? It takes a lot of rigor. And frankly, just like probably any business or any industry, you're busy people. You're busy in whatever your service line is, right? Healthcare is no different. We're busy taking care of patients. And so you really have to you have to have a plan and just force the practice of it. We get some of our practice with some of our systems on maybe a routine basis because we've got maintenance to do. So for instance, our electronic healthcare record, we have almost monthly a downtime. So guess who gets really good at that? Night shift. When do we schedule natural disasters? No. So when you have, what it really calls out is you really have to have that plan and that awareness of how do we make sure that our the people that need to do the work, if it's business oriented, how are they going to function? When do you carve out time and really force, because I won't say that no one wants to do it, but I will say it's probably not high on most people's list of important things to do, unless you're like my friend Grant Finch, who's the emergency management coordinator, right? That's his thing. He gets that scheduled. In fact, he's got a thing on my calendar to make sure my Gets card works. So I really just can't say enough about have a plan for training, enforce it. I would love to see, even in healthcare, some of the things like, especially for those shifts that don't maybe have the opportunity to routinely practice it. We try to do a lot of our scheduled work during the lesser busy hours, so that it's not such an impact to healthcare. But to really think of creative ways to do some training, and then attestation, whether that's a skills-based test that you do, or you're just saying, if you can't do that, at least have people have the accountability to say, I read the material and I'm assigning my name to it. In the bigger picture of the hospital, you referred to the incident command system. Healthcare has that too. It's probably leveraging a lot of that FEMA-based work, so that we have a standard nomenclature. There's pillars of work, some assigned for logistics versus the incident commander versus communications and planning. All of that, it's a really big effort. People get assigned. It's not always the same people in every role. So in some ways, people get opportunity to practice that. And we're really fortunate that we're very forgiving and mentor people in the moment. It really requires that kind of flexibility. And I do see that even with what little bit I experienced with the recent fire situation, is that in many ways, people can be at their best. You do see the worst sometimes, but it's always that joyful experience to see people are really rallying and really ready and want to help out. So that's good. There's a little bit more grace with that. In terms of what our company does on a yearly basis outside of our systems, when it comes to preparing for disasters, we and again, this is more in Grant's bailiwick, he does, and the person in that role, or in your organization, you would have someone in your role who really plans out some kind of event. For us, it involves the fire department, EMS, it might involve schools, it might involve other entities to really, and they're not always the same exercise, but it's usually a day that we do this. And we have different scenarios. Sometimes it's a mass casualty. Sometimes it's a natural event. So they're not always the same. And as much as people don't maybe want to do it, we're always glad we did. We always learn something from it. And the upside of having up systems that are reliable is that you can be a victim of your own success. And then if you take that away from people, it's amazing how compromised they get very quickly if they can't get that important policy from the internet solution. Or so there's a real range in magnitude, is my point. There's the big ticket items, natural disasters, and then there's the things that no one wants to happen, but you make a mistake when you're doing some switch change, and you maybe take the network down for a little bit when you didn't plan to, that kind of thing. So anyway, practice.
Thanks, Jerri-Jo.
Lane, if I could also expand off of what Jerri-Jo said.
Sounds good, Ben. We just got to make sure we keep some time for Q&A at the end here, but feel free to jump in.
I just have a little ham radio caveat that I would like to see expanded into kind of the practice that Jerri-Jo shared about planning events to come up with those out-of-the-box solutions that may not seem obvious. Ham radio operators participate in this thing called Ham Radio Field Day every year. It's a contest where you have 24 hours to contact as many other stations as you can on different frequencies you get multiplier points because it's a point system. The more off-grid you are and the more remote you are. If you find a special place, you can actually be on 3 county lines in Oregon and off the grid and get all the points. But the point is, it's a way to have fun and practice communicating off of the grid. I think we need something similar for IT and collaboration with public and private sectors here, at least in Lane County. And it should reflect something like, okay, all the fiber goes down in the county. Let's see how much data we can pass between each other, or how much data can you download from a county server. At least with my experience volunteering with OIR, the restoration of the internet back into the Mackenzie River Valley was not straightforward. Solutions that had been developed didn't work because of the topography. And I would like to see us respond more rapidly to that situation. And because we have such diverse topography and infrastructure challenges in Lane County and maybe even the state of Oregon, I think some sort of off-grid IT field day would be very cool.
Thanks, Ben. Before we transition into the Q&A portion here, I just want to personally, I just want to thank the volunteers from OIR. Our distance learning school year could not have happened if it wasn't for their efforts to restore, limited connectivity to the community and then to the school district. And we're still working over those backhauls and those connections that folks from as far away from Washington State have had a hand in doing. So thank you, and I tip my hats to you all, and I hope that's a model that catches on and spreads throughout the rest of the nation, because internet is super vital to what we do now. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. I think we need to open it up for questions from the participants, and I'm not quite sure what's the best way to do that. Should I have the attendees raise hands and call on them, or what do you think, Sally?
Absolutely. You can raise your hand, or we can prompt your question in the chat box if you want to put them in the chat box too.
Okay, I'm not seeing any.
There's one from Kathy Keeble. She asks, how can we form an ICS system to distribute COVID vaccines?
So I think patients might be able to chime in on this a little bit.
Yeah.
But, I was just going to say, at the state level, Oregon Health Authority is currently leading that effort with the Department of Human Services, and they do have a full-time response team that is working through those challenges right now. But I know a lot of it's happening at the county level too. So patients.
Yeah, so it's as you all know, the vaccination distribution plan isn't humming right along like we'd like to see, and we've had an incident command post stood up at Health and Human Services since February, and they're currently working on the process of, if the state Oregon Health Authority determines to push those vaccinations to public health for us to distribute, we need to have a good plan in place, and we're using our current ICP system to determine what that vaccination plan could look like, so we can distribute those materials much faster here within Lane County.
Thanks, William and Patience. Had a question from John Simpson. Paul, you might be able to answer this one. Does FirstNet support backbone region-to-region comm, or is it mainly a local comm solution, phone to phone?
No, that's a great question that we get quite a bit. No, so when we are restoring our network via an asset, such as what you see behind my shoulder, which is a CAL, a cell on wheels, if we pull out a trailer, if we bring in a couple suitcases to establish a quote unquote FirstNet network, what we're doing is we're creating a wireless network, voice and data, that works with your standard devices, your iPhones, your Android devices, your iPads, your computers. whatever you have to communicate with. But we're creating a privatized network for public safety. When we're creating that network, we're linking you to the outside world. We're allowing you to make calls outside that region to really anywhere in the world, just like you're standing in an area that has not been affected. So we are creating a bubbled network from a 1 mile radius to potentially 5 miles in the smallest cases, to allow first responders and those other organizations that are supporting the emergency to communicate just like they normally do on a normal cellular network, but on a privatized network for FirstNet users. So it is region to region, and there are also other applications that we're supporting that Will and his teams used during the Holiday Farm fire. You know, we were able to deploy an iPhone with a push-to-talk application, and now that push-to-talk application is able to act as a radio from that Holiday Farm incident back to anybody that's in the US, have instant radio communications either to another cell phone or into another radio network instantly. So we're definitely not creating just a localized network. We are creating a localized network that allowing you to call and use data services to other parts of the region.
Thanks, Paul. So got a couple questions here, but these ones are directed more not to panelists, but to TAO as an organization, and then kind of to Matt for some of his thoughts. So from Randy to TAO, given that wildfires are likely in our future, what will TAO be doing for business members thinking about alternative working spaces and helping them recover their comms, etc.?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Randy. We're getting a lot more of these questions from our membership statewide about how we can convene and provide a forum to share best practices and really, I would say, share and pool ideas for this. Swan Island Networks is one to watch. They're based in Portland, and they just put in a infrastructure for a Portland resilience network for the city. They're also working with New York City, and it's brand new as of a couple months ago. And they're also interested in putting one in for the Willamette Valley, which is basically a whole platform for communications and supports more information and resources for emergency response, specifically for private sector. And so we're definitely looking for more opportunities to connect our membership with that. So feel free to follow up with me if you have other ideas, because it's really important.
You know, speaking from the school district's perspective, just the same thing is finding a place to operate when you're being impacted is tough to do. So any support you can provide to members would be appreciated. Mike McCaffrey, let's see, but did I say your last name right, Mike? Sorry if I miss McFarland. I'm sorry. Mike wants to know Matt's thoughts on how to build it back better locally. What's some discussions that are taking place that you know about, Matt?
Sure thing. I think if there is a silver lining about all the telecommunications issues upriver, it is that there are a lot of great conversations happening right now. You know, I think it's recognized that a aerial fiber build that's a single route up into a region that is prone to trees falling and snowmageddons and now wildfires is not a recipe for resilience. And so folks like Doug Toomey, with support from Randy Niels and others, have a plan that I think that they're submitting to FEMA perhaps today that would do a world of good. That's a longer term resiliency solution, a tertiary network or a 3-tiered network that includes a underground fiber build all the way on the other side of the Cascades. So that's one big project, I think, that could do an immense good, not just for the upper McKenzie area, but for a large portion of that geography of the state. Another one is being pursued by Elevate Technology Group, the McKenzie School District itself, to pursue dollars from US Ignite. That project specifically would lean into the microwave backhaul that the Oregon Internet Response folks pioneered. and then build fiber from a tower that lands that connection out to the school, perhaps piloting some proof of concept CBRS in the area. So those are just a couple of the projects that are out there being discussed. I think eWeb and Lane Electric are also discussing some projects. I think that it's projects like those that could build it back better and learn from the lessons of the Holiday Farm fire.
I think if all goes according to plan, we'll be one of the more connected areas in the state. It should be great. So I think, we're bumping up to our 1 o'clock deadline. I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first one's really, really quick. Mike asked if this will be recorded for future viewing. I think Sally, it'll be on the TAO website and available.
Yes, and Onward as well. We'll put them on our YouTube channels. It'll be available for everybody.
Perfect. And then this one might be a little longer question. I think we'll end with this. Joe Mole asks, curious to know if the recent experiences have made any of you more inclined to advocate for and support fully public high-speed internet access as an element of federal, state, local infrastructure, like our transportation infrastructure.
I think I can talk to that a little bit. It's a subject that motivates me because of how difficult and challenging it was to restore connectivity, at least to the upper Mackenzie River Valley. There was only one fiber optic line run out of Eugene up there. That was all the connectivity there, and any secondary possibilities burned up on Mount Hagen. So there wasn't great infrastructure to start with. And I think a big lesson coming out of this, a big bottleneck to restoration is infrastructure. But infrastructure is hard to build. And I see building more fiber as being expensive and challenging, especially when you get into mountainous areas, because there's a lot of volcanic rock, which you have to drill through. You can't just dig a trench. One asset that Oregon has over a lot of other states is we have a lot of tall mountains, and you can link those mountaintops with microwave backhaul. And I would love to entertain the idea of helping the state build a high-speed microwave backhaul network that is very diverse and resilient, and make them the incumbents, basically. So counties, state, federal agencies would be the holders on the network, and then you can follow kind of the federal CBRS model, and which kind of divvies up and licenses out extra bandwidth on that backhaul system. I think something like that could be very valuable, and it could be very feasible to build.
Yeah, it's Paul. I'd like to mention one thing about one of the top priorities for FirstNet is growing rural coverage, not for just public safety, but also growing rural data connectivity for citizens. Rural connectivity is extremely important for our public safety because the reliance upon commercial cellular providers for voice and data is huge. But typically the build process for cellular carriers is really to enhance where the population is, where the population lives, and where people travel to. But it's really hasn't grown as it should to our rural communities, both where people are living and where our public safety is actually supporting. So one of the biggest priorities that we have as FirstNet is we're actually working directly with every single state and every single territory with public safety leadership in those states to determine where networks need to grow out to, again, to support public safety and citizens. In every single state and every territory, we actually have already a committed plan that we're delivering on. And in Oregon, we've turned up 17 cell sites in the last 12 months in very rural parts of Oregon. These areas did not have coverage before, and we're bringing a minimum layer of LTE coverage to both citizens and public safety because of what FirstNet is doing. We have the capabilities, we have the funding to actually grow networks, and you're going to see in Q1 of 2021 here, between January and beginning of April, we're going to have another dozen cell sites on air that is going to benefit both communities. So we want this community, the attendees, to be extremely vocal to your public safety leadership of where you need coverage to grow. FirstNet's not perfect. We need to continue to build. We need to continue to hear what the needs are. And that's why building those relationships with all of your private community and private vendors is huge. And continue advocating for yourself and for what you need.
I know we need to wrap, and Lane had to jump, but there is a question specifically for you, Paul, and maybe you and Randy can follow up, just the two of you. Randy, I know that Paul put his contact information in the chat box, but I just want to be sensitive to everyone's time here, and so so we're going to wrap up. But wow, what an inspiring and amazing event. Thank you to everyone. There's such an amazing community here, and between you know, all the highlights among preparation and planning and training is what I'm really taking away from this is certainly all of those elements we need, but it's the relationships too. And so, you know, our endeavor here is to also help instigate more of those relationships. And we want to continue to do that and bring that to action. In 10 days, our legislators will convene for winter session. I know the governor has earmarked about $118 million for rural broadband. And starting next week, there's going to be 3,200 bills introduced into Oregon legislature for the next session. And so I just want to put a pin in the policy and advocacy conversation and how important it is for us to move forward together. We can help with that. And so it's a really important piece of this. And so I just want to mention that's something TAO has its hands in, and we want to work together. So if you have any thoughts on policy and advocacy for this, please reach out. But otherwise, just want to say thank you. Matt, do you want to say a few wrap up words as well?
I would just echo that commentary. You know, planning and training are key ingredients towards preparation. And I heard a lot of acronyms decoded and opportunities to educate ourselves and be prepared for whatever comes next. So this is truly wonderful, and I look forward to putting this recording out on YouTube with TAO and getting this information out to the broader public. So thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you for Lane Tompkins for moderating. Thank you to Emerald Broadband, Elevate Technology Group, Lane County Government for sponsoring this event. This is just a fantastic afternoon. Thank you, panelists. That was just great. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For having us. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.